Well, good day to everybody. This is Ted Pattison of Critical Path Training, and I appreciate you taking some time to come visit us today for this webinar. So the program at hand is to start prepping for the Microsoft 365 Developer Certification. This is something that is fairly new. If I take just a second to move over to a different let me get to a browser here before we get into our program. And what I want to do is, first of all, go to this URL. Now, I'm going to take this URL and I'm going to go ahead and put it into the chat window. There's a couple URLs I want to show you at first. And this one right here kind of talks about the program, the Microsoft 365 Certified Developer Associate. You know, there is an exam that is in beta right now. And you can take it now. It's kind of, sometimes it's, if you know the topics at hand, they're more forgiving in the beta cycle. So if that's something you want to do, feel free to go ahead and do that. Also note that there's quite a few topics here, of skills that are going to be measured. Now, there's a downloadable certificate or a downloadable PDF file, where we can see, what the actual skills are going to be. So today we're going to basically look at the first section, implement Microsoft Identity, which is basically how do we configure security in Azure AD, how do we write code and things like C# and JavaScript and TypeScript to be able to authenticate and acquire access tokens so we can use them. So that's what we're going to cover today. Note that the next topic here is build apps with Microsoft Graph. So that will probably be our next webinar a little bit down the road. We also have extend and customize SharePoint. Everyone loves that topic. We have extend Microsoft Teams. And then finally, we have extend Office, which kind of uses the older Office add-in model. I guess Microsoft's trying to revive that. But, that will indeed be our series of topics. So it looks like we'll have 5 different webinars. And once again, what we're going to look at today, is the important things for security. So registering an application, implementing authentication, configuring permissions so you can consume an API. There's lots of different APIs that we could call, but given that Microsoft Graph, the Microsoft Graph API, is the next topic that we're going to talk about, all the examples that I'm going to do today are going to authenticate using the Microsoft Graph API. Okay, one other thing to note is that I'm going to move over to my website, just do a quick plug. At Critical Path Training, we have this one particular training course, which is Modern SharePoint and Microsoft Teams Development. And if I go ahead and kind of take a look at our training outline, you're going to see it's very, very similar to what they have had there. And hopefully any second now we'll see it. As far as, what other topics. Now, of course, in our training course, we're covering quite a bit of stuff that's not going to be on the exam, like how to get started with Node.js, how to get started with TypeScript, how to start using React. So when we get to things like SharePoint and Teams, and Microsoft gives us Node.js based templates, based on TypeScript and React, the idea of this training course is it kind of gives you the skills so that you can live through those development experiences of kind of using the new modern tools. The one thing I see changing is that in this course we have embedding Power BI reports, and arguably I've got that in a Power BI developer course, so I think we're going to get rid of this and add in the Office add-in APIs. So basically this course will have complete coverage of what is going to be on the exam. Okay, now let's go ahead and start up with our content. So what I want to do is I'm going to kind of start with some conceptual background, about the things that we need to know to really understand the security model, that you have to work with as a Microsoft Cloud developer. So let's kind of start with this thing called OAuth. So one of the problems that we have is that your code is going to have to make an authorized call into an API, such as the Microsoft Graph API. And before you can do that, you need to acquire an access token. Now, if you look at OAuth, they have a lot of concepts that are important. For instance, you're the user. We kind of refer to you as the resource owner. You're the person who has something like a organizational account And when my application talks to the Microsoft Graph API, it might do so on your behalf. So once again, you're the resource owner. Now, you have this term client, and the term client and the term application kind of mean the same thing. The client is where your code runs. Now, as part of the process of acquiring an access token, OAuth has us go to this thing which is the authorization server. And in our case, that's going to be Azure Active Directory up in the cloud. And we implement what's called an authentication flow. And the whole purpose of an authentication flow is to get the access token to your client application. Now, there has to be many different types of authentication flows because there's many different types of client applications. Let's say I have 3 client applications. One runs on the server as an ASP.NET or an ASP.NET Core application. One runs totally inside the browser, maybe using React or some other kind of single-page application library. And another one runs on an iPhone. So what you'll see is because we have very different scenarios, we have to have different styles of authentication flows. Some are more secure than others. In some, we have to kind of lower the security bar to some degree because it's the only way to get an access token, back to that particular client application. Now, you also have the things that we want to access, the APIs. So in OAuth, they're often called resources or resource servers or resource services. Now, the way things work is that your application goes through an authentication flow and it basically gets an access token. Once you have an access token, you're then able to take that access token, and each time you make a call to a particular resource, like the Microsoft Graph API, that access token has to be passed in a special request header, which is the authorization header. Now, the idea of the access token is that the authorization server is able to basically embed the permissions that the client application has into the access token. Therefore, the resource, like the Microsoft Graph API, can simply look at the access token you've passed it to see if you have the right permissions for being able to accomplish what you're trying to do. And either it sees you have the permissions and it allows the call to go on, or it sees you don't have permissions and it sends back an access denied error. Now, an access token is what we call a bearer token. And bearer tokens basically mean whoever has it can use it. So people like to make the analogy that an access token is like cash, not like your ATM card. So if you drop your ATM card, people can't use it because they don't have your PIN. If you drop cash, they can readily use it. So one of the problems with access tokens is that if they fall into the wrong hands, they can be used by an attacker. So whenever we pass access tokens around, we pass them around with HTTPS, basically TLS or SSL, and also access tokens have a very short lifetime. In Azure AD, the lifetime is just over an hour, and the idea is that if an access token is sitting around and a bad guy finds it, but it's a day later, that access token's no good. Now, inside the access token, if I just look a couple things, we have things like who is the issuer, what is the authentication method. So this kind of tells you, was it just a password? Do we have two-factor authentication? We have things about timing. When was it initialized at? When does it expire? If you look at these numbers, kind of strange, it's not on the test, but this is the number of seconds since the beginning of the year in 1970. That's how they give time. And then you're going to have things like, what is the tenant ID? What is the application ID? What is the audience? What is that thing that you're trying to access and you want permissions for? Now, also, we're going to have scopes. So we're going to see how we basically pass scopes out, but basically they are the delegated permissions that you want, can be passed inside of that scope. Okay. Now, one of the important things about OAuth is that we have to register applications ahead of time. So think of it like a user account. When a user comes into your organization, someone has to add a new user account inside of Azure AD. And once that happens, the user gets credentials, the user can log on, the user can establish his or her identity. So when I want to run an application and I want it to be able to authenticate itself and to authenticate users, we need to basically register that application with the authorization server, which in our case is Azure AD. And whenever you do that, Azure AD creates an identifier, which is a GUID. Now, depending on the type of application you are creating, sometimes you need to register permissions, sometimes you don't. Sometimes you need to register a reply URL, sometimes you don't. Sometimes you need to register credentials, sometimes you don't. So we're going to go through a bunch of demos to kind of show examples of all these. But the idea is that not all applications are the same, so they don't all have the same requirements when you register them. Now, another thing to note is that when OAuth came out, we had the first version, OAuth, kind of what we think of as OAuth 1. Now, OAuth 1 started getting some pretty good traction, and when it did, a lot of big companies began to notice. So I think of Microsoft and Twitter and Google. And so as they started creating the second version of OAuth, all these big companies started coming to the standards meetings, and there was a real push to make some changes. So a big problem with the first version of OAuth is that you could not use SSL. You couldn't use the automatic encryption to send things across the wire, so the developer had to do the encryption, which was a lot of extra work. There were some other issues with it that made it tough to use, and so there was this one desire to kind of make it easier. There was other needs to allow for things like mobile devices. So there was a bunch of changes that were made to OAuth 2, and when OAuth 2 finally shipped, the person who created OAuth, the first version, made this big stink, made all these public blog posts that this is going to be really unsafe, and he was right. A year later, there was all these issues where we had cross-site forgery attacks. Now, if I go back a couple slides, here's the core problem with OAuth 2 by itself. We have an access token. We take the access token and we push it to the resource. So OAuth 2 gave the resource the ability to get keys from the authorization server and check and basically validate that the access token came from the authorization server. However, they never gave your client application the ability to do that. In OAuth 2, the idea is that the access token is opaque. Think of the client application as you, and the access token is a note your teacher has given you to take home to your mother. You're not supposed to look at it. Well, the problem was that if the client can't validate the access token, who's to stop a bad guy from swapping out his access token for the real access token? So that's the kind of the problem that we had. Now, what happened is that OAuth 2 shipped. A bunch of sites who implemented OAuth 2 started having problems. Facebook was probably the highest visible site that was attacked with cross-site forgery attacks. But then in the short term, all these different companies kind of locked down their OAuth 2 implementations with their own proprietary implementations. But then what we had is they decided that we needed another specification to sit on top of OAuth 2, and that's what OpenID Connect is. So now we're going to be using OAuth 2 together with OpenID Connect. And the idea is that when you get an access token, it also gives you an ID token, and now the authorization provider gives the client a way to validate the ID token and therefore the access token, and we can get rid of basically a large set of attacks that were happening. Now, you don't have to think of OAuth 2 and OpenID as different protocols. They combine. You can just think of it as a single protocol. In fact, if someone today says, I'm using OAuth 2, we assume you're using OpenID Connect or you're not secure. And if someone says, I'm using OpenID Connect, well, it's built on top of OAuth 2. So really just kind of think of them, as the same, big, safe protocol. Now, when we start working with Azure AD and I need to register my first application, some of the things we need to ask so we can create our application properly is, where are my users? Do all my users live within my organization? So if I'm working for one company and we have 300 users and they all have user accounts in a single tenant, that's a common scenario. Maybe I'm an independent software vendor and I have a web service that I want customers in many different organizations to be able to use. So I can also create something that's multi-tenant. And I see that here my slide has kind of left something to be questioned right here. Okay, so what is the other thing? So maybe I have users that might be in a Microsoft tenant, but they also might be Microsoft consumer accounts, things like live.com. Okay, now where does your application run? And that kind of asks the question, is your application going to be public or confidential? Now, a confidential client can keep a secret. So if you have an ASP.NET application and it has server-side code and a server-side app settings file or a server-side web config file, you can keep secrets, so you're said to be a confidential client. Now, if we're running things as a single-page application and everything loads into the browser, we're going to assume that the bad guy can see anything that goes across the wire and gets loaded into the browser. So we have some applications where we kind of say that they're public, meaning they can't keep any secrets. And so we can still do authentication. We're just not going to be quite as secure as if we had a confidential client that could keep a secret. Okay. Another question we have is that when your application authenticates and gets an access token and starts talking to the Microsoft Graph API, do you want to do that on behalf of the current user and basically be restricted to what the user has as far as permissions? Or do you want to get an app-only token and basically interact as the app itself? So the way that you set up your application and the way that you authenticate, it can basically allow you to authenticate as the user or authenticate as the app. And then finally, how and when, should your application ask for permissions? And how do permissions get granted? So these are a lot of the questions that we have to know the answer to be successful. Now, in my first demo, I'm going to look at a couple different authentication flows. So we have user password credential flow, and that's basically when we just kind of take a user name and password and pass it across the network. Okay, it's kind of seen as the least secure, but it gives us a way, to basically authenticate quickly. And for some scenarios where security is not an issue, it works fine. There is a new authentication flow that Microsoft has, which is the device code flow that we're going to look at today. Also, there's client credential flow. So remember, client means your application. So client credentials flow means I want to get an app-only token. All the other authentication flows we're going to look at are going to authenticate as a user. So you'll have a user token, where client credentials flow, basically gives us a app-only token. Now, there's also a very secure, kind of the, what we kind of think of as the most secure authentication flow, which is authorization code flow. Only works from a confidential client, and it requires server-side secrets to be kept. Okay. And also, we have implicit flow, and that's used when I have something like a single-page application. And the idea of implicit flow is that you can't keep a secret because everything's running inside the browser. And then also, if you have authorization code flow and you have server-side code, we can acquire an access token in a server-to-server call and never pass the access token through the browser. However, if you're running a single-page application, you have to basically take the access token to the browser. So the implicit flow, has contingencies to allow for that. Okay. Now, we want to get started with the Azure portal. So let's go back, and I'm going to move over to the Azure portal. And I've got a couple different applications, but once again, if you go to just the Azure portal, I guess I'll kind of just quickly, the first time, start from the top. And then over on the left-hand side, if I drop down the navigation, and there is Azure Active Directory. Okay, and I've just bookmarked this page so I can come back. So here I can do things like I can see my users, I can see the different groups, but I'm going to call out app registrations. So here is where we're going to register an app. I got a couple apps here I've already created, maybe just to start from scratch. Let's go ahead and kind of delete all these so we kind of have a clean slate to get started with here. Okay, pretty responsive. Now, do I have all applications? Almost there. Let me just go ahead and delete one, and we'll delete two. Okay, and now truly we have no applications left. Now, what I want to do is, let's say that I want to create a new application. So we're going to click on Register New Application, and I can say App 1, and up top here, Supported Account Types. So here's where you can determine where your users are going to be running. And the first choice is all my users are in the tenant where we're registering this application. So we refer to that as single tenant. It's also possible for you to say accounts in any organization. So you have to have a Microsoft organizational account, can't have a personal account, but now users in other tenants can basically authenticate to my application that I've registered in my tenant. And, quite common for ISVs to use this pattern. And then there's also accounts in any organizational directory or personal accounts. So Microsoft now has a way to kind of tie in things like Skype and Xbox users, as well. Now, let's keep this with single tenant. And then down here, you have a redirect URI. And this is a little bit strange or not quite as straightforward because this is actually where you pick public client versus confidential client. Now, let's say that, in our first demo, I want to go ahead and use a public client. So I can choose public client, and then there's also a redirect URL. So let's say that I just go ahead and pick something like, in our first demo, we're going to have a console application. So it's not even going to be web-based. And there are cases where you have to register a URL, even though it's not going to be a live endpoint. And then the client, when they authenticate, have to pass the exact same URL. So I'm going to basically say local host and then /app1234. So now I'll go ahead and click register, and I've created my application. Now here, what you can see is that we have a client ID, and what's been really confusing for the last couple years is that there are these two terminology sets that are colliding. Some people call it the application, some people call it the client. So there's always been this confusion of application ID versus client ID. It's the same thing. It would have been better if we just picked one of those terms and stuck with it. But just remember that you have a GUID that identifies the application. Some people call it the client ID. Some people call it the application ID. Some people call it the app ID. Okay, and then there's also going to be a GUID that identifies the tenant. Okay, let's go back a couple more slides here. So I just kind of went through and created a quick application. But what's going to happen is that your application has to then talk to Azure AD. It's going to identify itself by passing that GUID of the client ID. There's going to be a bunch of other criteria we have to meet, but at the end of the day, what we need to get back is an access token. Once we have the access token, we're done with Azure AD, for at least an hour, because the access token is good for an hour, and we can use it, to call into our resources. Okay, now there's this issue where when we talk to Azure AD, there is a set of endpoints that Microsoft created quite a ways back, 8 years ago, and that is what we refer to as the V1 endpoint. And Microsoft, over the last year or two, has had a new authentication endpoint in preview, and that went GA last May, and that's the Azure AD V2 endpoint. So generally, the V2 endpoint is what's going to be on the certification test. And then also, let's look at the different libraries. If you're writing .NET code, you're writing JavaScript or TypeScript code, it makes a lot of sense to use one of the libraries that Microsoft had so that you don't have to kind of issue low-level HTTP calls to implement an authentication flow. Quite often, it's just making a simple call to a function in a library. So there is the one library that we've been using for a while. So it works with the V1 endpoint, which is Microsoft.IdentityModel.Clients.Active Directory, what people refer to as ADL. Okay, that's the old one. Many of you probably use that, but that's not the one on the test. So when you want to start programming against the Azure AD V2 endpoint, we use the newer library, the Microsoft Authentication Library, MSAL. And definitely, if you want to get prepared for the certification test, know the new stuff, not the old stuff. Now, what are some of the reasons that we like the V2 endpoint? So the V1 endpoint has a brittle way to allow users to consent. Now, what's going to happen is that when you create an application, your application is going to say, I require these 3 permissions. And the first time that a user authenticates, Azure AD provides a consent framework that is then going to bring up a dialog and ask that user, this app wants to run on your behalf and use these 3 permissions. The user has to consent. And when the user consents, Azure AD has something that remembers that, and then we don't have to ask the user anymore. Okay, so the problem with the original V1 endpoint is you only had one real opportunity to ask the user. So let's say that we have 3 permissions that aren't too significant, and then one that the user is going to think of is really, really dangerous. So if your application, when the user first authenticates, only asks for 3 permissions, and the user grants them, there's no smooth way later on when the user finally clicks that button to do, the task where we need a much greater permission. You can't come later and ask for more permissions. So you got to do it all in one shot. So with the Azure V2 endpoint, things get to be much easier because each time you make a request, it doesn't matter if the user has consented before. You can basically add what permissions you want. And if the user has granted all those permissions to your app before, there's no need for the user to consent. But if the user has already consented to 3 permissions and you ask for the 4th, it then brings up the consent dialog and makes the user consent again. Okay. There's also a new authentication flow in the Azure V2 endpoint called device code flow that we're going to look at. And then also the Azure V2 endpoint is what supports personal accounts. So the V1 endpoint only supports organizational accounts. And those are the 3 main differences or that make the V2 endpoint better. Okay. Now, as you saw, when you create an application, are you going to create it as a web, which kind of means confidential, which means it can keep secrets that can't be seen, by an attacker? And if I make it public, well, we're going to kind of loosen the rules for authentication just to make it so that we can still succeed. Now, another thing we want to talk about is this big difference between the application and a service principal. Now, when you install an application, you get an application ID. And even if you create an application that's multi-tenant, when you go to those other tenants and they want to refer to your application, they use the same application ID. However, when we have a multi-tenant application, you need something which is called a service principal because we need something which is a tenant-specific representation of the object. So for instance, let's say that I have a multi-tenant app and then people from other tenants begin to use it. So what we need is we need a tenant-specific object, and that's what this thing called the service principal is. And the service principal does things like it remembers when users have consented to a permission. Okay, so differentiating between the application and the service principal gets to be important. If I go back here, now there's the application ID. There is the tenant ID. What's this object ID? That is the service principal. Okay, so if you ever need the GUID, you can see it from there. Now, just to, go through this one more time, because this is going to be on the exam as well. So just remember the application is kind of defined once across all tenants. And it's identified, using that global application ID. And the application basically lives in the tenant where it's registered. And that one global definition defines its auth type. Is it public client versus web? Does it have credentials? Does it require permissions? But then the service principal, that has that object ID, that tracks anything that has to be tracked on a per tenant basis. Now, even in this case right here, let's get back here, and we just kind of looked at this. Let me start this up one more time. Even in the case where you only have a single tenant application, they still create the service principal. Okay, so it's always going to be there. Now, another thing that is kind of listed on the Microsoft exam, is identify topology options. So who is going to be, a consumer user? So that's Microsoft personal accounts. If you just register to use OneDrive but not with a company, or Outlook, MSN accounts, Xbox Live accounts, those are all considered consumer accounts. Now, for enterprise accounts, just means you live, within an Office 365 tenant or an Azure AD tenant. And so quite often you have single tenant applications, one org. If you have multi-tenant, you basically have one business that is allowing other businesses and the users in those other businesses to authenticate. So multi-tenant kind of gives you your B2B. And then that third option, allows you to have a, business to consumer when you basically allow those personal accounts. Okay, now let's say that I need permissions. So let's say we come back here, and now what we'd like to do with this application I've created called App 1, let's go ahead and move to permissions. And as I move to permissions inside here, if I say add a permission, first of all, I have to pick the API, which is the resource. And then when I do that, we'll notice that you have delegated permissions, which are user specific, and you have application permissions, which are not specific to a user. Now, in most cases, we authenticate as a user, and therefore we're going to use delegated permissions. And remember that the user has to grant your application, has to consent to your application to use the permissions, which gets to be important, and that your application can never do anything more than the user is allowed to do. So you're constrained by the user's permission. If I have application permissions, what that gives the application to do is to run without any constraint from a user. And quite often you'll find something like a delegated permission will be access the current user's inbox, where the application permission, it can be far more powerful because it can be something such as access any inbox of any user across the whole organization. And also remember that we looked at different authentication flows. Client credential flow will basically allow you to kind of get to this application permissions. But any type of user-based authentication, you have to rely on delegated permissions. Okay, now what I want to do is make sure we kind of spend some time doing some interesting stuff here. What I want to do is kind of move to an example of using PowerShell. Now, let me show you one more thing here. If I go to GitHub, I have a GitHub repository. And this GitHub repository has the demos and the slides from today. So once again, I'm going to go ahead and put that into the chat window and send it to everybody. And there's some demos that we want to look at in here. So first thing I want to do, and once again, everything that I'm doing here, you have a copy of this if you download it. Let's go to scripts. And while you can create applications, with the basically by hand, you can also create them with PowerShell scripts. So, here's an example of, some of these particular applications inside here. So, in a little bit, I'm going to run this SPA demo, but let's go ahead and register that now. So note that this is using a set of Azure AD commandlets. Now here, I've got a username and password, and I've got a little way to automatically authenticate without having to put in a username and password. So here's my username. I have a password that's way over to the right, so you can't see it. But now what's going to happen is we're going to call new Azure AD. We're going to pass in the display name, And is it a public client? So is it web, confidential client, or is it public? So when I run this demo, this is going to be a confidential client. Is it available in other tenants? Yes or no? Do we have a reply URL? Okay, let's go ahead and run this right here. And the idea is that, once this runs inside here, it then is able to create the application. So if I go back over to Azure AD, and now if we go take a look at the different applications, and now let's go ahead and do a refresh inside here, what we should see is that, my script was able to create this application. The way I write my scripts, I also write them so as they run, they're able to kind of create a quick text file of the things that I'm going to need to put, inside of my application. Okay, now if I look at permissions here, you'll also see that my application, was able to add permissions. If you look at this script, this code's a little bit gnarly, but here is where I'm able to write some PowerShell code to create these things that are Microsoft.open Azure AD model resource access. And if you say scope, you're asking for delegated permissions. And unfortunately, you got to kind of use the GUID to make this work. Now, if I go look at this right here, this display permissions, what I want you to see here is that let's say that I wanted to do something, where I can kind of see all the permissions that Microsoft Graph has. Okay, so what I need to do, I didn't do that quite right. Almost there. Let's go back here. Let's go ahead and take this with my password that you can't see way out to the right. Okay, and what we're going to do with this example right here is that I can say get Azure AD service principal, and if I ask for the app ID of the Microsoft Graph API, this gives me back the service principal in my tenant for that. And now let's go ahead and run this right here, and you kind of see what it's going to do as it runs, is that now I've kind of created this file right here that basically just kind of spits out all the different permissions. So notice that first we have delegated permissions. And note that some delegated permissions require admin permissions, and those are marked as that. Others just require user permissions. And one of the problems about using PowerShell is you can't use this friendly name. You have to use the GUID. Okay. And, this is just a little technique that I've used, so as I register these inside here, I'm able to, quickly figure out what are the GUIDs I need, to register these individual permissions. Okay. Now, let's go look at one of these demos. So what I'm going to do is let's go back into demo. And the first demo we'll look at is the SPA auth demo. And so I'm going to go ahead and open that up with Visual Studio Code. Now, if you haven't used NPM and Visual Studio Code, this might be a little bit new, hopefully not too shocking. But what I have here is I have kind of a simple Node.js application that just uses one Node.js utility, which is called Browser Sync. So I'm going to say npm install. And the idea is I just have one npm package, which can basically fire up a web server and test this page we're about to look at. Now, if I look at this one particular web page right here, I've wanted to keep, this first demo as simple as possible. So notice that we're using the Microsoft Authentication Library JS file. And we have a button, and we're going to click and do a sign in. Now, if I want to run this application, note that I can simply say npm run start. Okay, so back down here, we'll say npm run start. And as I do that, it should basically fire up a little web server, start this thing up inside. And now you can kind of see, hey, here is the web page. Now, I'm going to bring this up. I'm going to bring up another piece right here, which is Fiddler, so we can kind of look and see what's going on behind the scenes. And also, when I click Sign In, note that we're going to run this function, but also note that this code is using the Microsoft Authentication Library. So we need a config object. Now, if I go back to that one text file, so basically I ran the application, such that I could now, quickly get the client ID or application ID and bring that up here. And we'll go ahead and save that particular code inside there. And now what do we want to do? We basically want to go to the Microsoft Graph API and call this endpoint. And also there is a permission, which is user.read. Now, if I go back to our page, I think because I made a change, I better go ahead and do a quick sign out and then sign back in. Okay, and what I'm going to do here to make sure that you can see this. Okay, let me start this one more time. I'm sorry, this demo could have been just a little bit smoother. Okay, we're going to start it one more time. And as we start this up here, okay, one more time, we will start it up from this point right here. Okay, so now I'm finally at a point where we can kind of see this, and let's go ahead and behind, we'll go ahead and we'll leave Fiddler, and let's go ahead and blank that out inside there, remove all. Now, when the user signs in, what you can see here is that the Microsoft Authentication Library will just automatically redirect him to a login at Microsoft.com page. And so now the user is basically going to sign in. Now that the user has signed in, here's where they're going to automatically bring up the consent screen. And once again, your application doesn't have to do anything. You basically just have to have the user log in, and your code, as you're logging in the user, has requested a certain set of permissions. And so if the user chooses accept, now what's going to happen is it's going to redirect, back to your particular page. If I go back down here and we kind of take a look at this right here, one of the things that you'll see here is that it sends back a page with a location, and then the access token, is basically put as a URL fragment. Okay, so this is what we think of as implicit flow. And what you're going to see is that there is the Microsoft Authentication Library, the JavaScript version, is what we use, to be able to authenticate. And hopefully, this web page shows just kind of a minimal amount of code that it requires, to be able to get there and get what we need. Now, let's kind of back down, to a simpler level. So what I want to do in this next demo is I'm going to go ahead and open up a simple console application, which is called Get User Token. So this is on our machines. And, inside of this, if I look inside of app settings right here, okay, so now what I have is an application that, let's go back here and kind of look at the managed or the NuGet packages. So as far as, what is installed here, we have Microsoft Graph, but we also have the Microsoft Identity Client. Okay, now what we want to be able to do is get a access token. So here's what we're going to do to start out with. Let's say at first I want to get user tokens. So I'm going to go back into Azure AD, and we're just going to create an application that is going to allow us to do that. So back here in Azure AD, we will create a new application, and inside of this particular application, and this is going to be our console app, and it's just for users in my organization, and because it's a console app, I'm going to have it be a public client, and there's a couple different cases where you still need to put a redirect URL, even though it doesn't have to be an endpoint. So I'll say local host /app1234 just to show you it's fairly arbitrary. Okay, so now that we have that, let's go ahead and register. So now that I have registered right here, let's go down to permissions. And inside of permissions, notice that they've already given you a user.read, which is kind of a required permission to be able to log in. But let's ask for another couple permissions. So I'll go to the Microsoft Graph. I'll go to delegated permissions. And now let's say, I want to access email. Maybe I would like to, let's go down to the organization, and maybe I want to read the organization information. Let's go ahead and choose permissions. Okay, so now we basically got our applications, but they're not granted yet. Okay, now if I go back, let's go back to the overview, so I can grab the application ID. And note with this application, I have app settings here. So now I'm going to come and swap that out with something different. Okay, and then I have the tenant name, and then I have the redirect URL. And so let's look at this code right here. So we're going to basically say get user info. Now, when we begin to use the Graph API, we're going to have to authenticate. And so what I've done for this demo is to provide a couple different classes that we can use when we program against the Microsoft Graph API, at least the .NET SDK version of it. So there is a particular interface which is called Authentication Provider. And what you need to do is you need to implement one of these classes, or you have to provide objects that implement this interface. And there's one method, which is authenticate request. So the way things work is that when you want to create the main proxy object that you use to talk to the Microsoft Graph, which is called a Graph Service Client, you need to pass it an auth provider. So I basically created 4 different kinds. And the first one we'll look at, is the user interactive auth provider. Now, when I look at this right here, what you can see is that when I'm using the Microsoft Authentication Library, there are builders. So here, we're going to use public client application builder create. And notice that here's my client ID. There is the tenant common authority. What is the common authority, you ask? If I go look at the common authority, note that I can specify /organizations. And the idea is, instead of me having to hard code what tenant I live in, if I just say /organizations, it will authenticate the user, and then it'll figure out on its own, what tenant it lives in. Okay. And the idea is we create this builder object, and now there is an acquire token interactive, which is basically just part of the library. There's with prompt, so as we prompt the user, we can decide that we would like the user to always consent to whatever permissions. I can say never prompt. I can say force login. Let's go ahead and just kind of say select account. But the idea is that whenever they need an access token, they're going to basically call this method. You're going to grab an access token, and you're going to basically add it to the authorization header. Okay. So at this point, let's go ahead and run this application. So as I run this application, and now there is my account right here. Let's go ahead and put in my password inside. We'll go ahead, and it's the first time I've authenticated. So basically, they're going to bring up the authentication screen or the consent screen. And after that, I'm able to get back my token. Okay. Now, I know you're curious. So let's go ahead and bring this up one more time. But now let's kind of spy on what's happening with Fiddler here. So the idea here is that, as I put in my credentials inside here and we authenticate, you can kind of see that, it's able to make a call inside there and pass in all kinds of things that we need. And then finally, I get back this object that has the access token. Okay, now let's look at a second example. So now you've kind of seen the first auth provider that does interactive. Now, the next one we're going to look at is direct password authentication. So if you're able to get access to the user's name and password, you can then say acquire token by username password. And what's neat about this is that it's not going to interact with the user. It's just going to grab the password. Now here, for me to use this, I simply have to switch this out and switch it back. Now I'm going to run this, and it's going to fail at first because there is a setting that you have to tweak to allow this to happen. So let's go back here. And under authentication, if I go down here, there is something which is called default client type. So if you're going to have resource owner password credential, you have to turn this on. So this is considered about as insecure as you can get. So Microsoft doesn't enable it by default. And note that once you enable this, now let's go back here. Let's count a couple seconds, just to make sure that it has time to do what it needs to do. And now let's go ahead and run this right here. And now what you'll see is it succeeds. And if I go back here to our friend Fiddler, what you can see here is that, it's just able to call across the network and basically just make kind of a single call to get back that access token. Okay. I don't think I've showed this yet, but also note that anytime we're calling into the graph, you're going to see that authorization bearer equals, and there's your access token inside there. Okay. Also note that if I take this and there's something which is called the text wizard. Let's say I send this to the text wizard, and now that I've sent that to the text wizard, it says bearer space. And now if I come down here, and now we decode this from base 64, what you can see here is, there is what the access token really looks like. So if you're ever kind of curious and you kind of want to see what lives inside of an access token, if I go back to this right here, and now we'll say add, and we'll add a, let's see, what am I going to add? I'm going to add a JSON file inside here. And once I have added a JSON file, what I should be able to do, this should not be that hard for Ted to find a place where we have JSON files. Oh gosh, okay, so I'll just add the right extension inside here, test.json, and that's not the right way, gosh. Okay, all I'm trying to do is add a JSON file so I can show you what it looks like. Let me quickly go here and add a file, and it's going to be test.json. And now that I have a JSON file, and I'll open it up in Visual Studio Code, and we'll paste that in and Control Shift F. Okay, you can kind of see exactly what the token looks like inside here, including what are the scopes that we got. Okay, so as I go down here and I look at all the different things that are in there, here's the password. Okay, so just a quick trick to see that. Now, let's look at a another flow. So the flow that we just looked at is the user direct credential flow. And Microsoft really frowns upon us using this one. In fact, when you move to .NET Core, this library does not even supply this method inside here. So let's look at this one, which is called the device code authentication flow. Okay, so to make this work, I'm simply going to come back and we'll get rid of that. We'll put this back here. Now, the way that this one is going to work is that when I authenticate, and this is kind of what you should use from a public client because it's considered much safer. So we're going to say public client application, and now we're going to say public client acquire token with device code. So I'll go ahead and run this right here. And let me make this a little bit smaller so I can kind of see everything at once. So what happens is that your application is kind of frozen. And one more time, if I go back down here, this code was running and this code is blocking. So it's not going to go further until someone puts in that device code. But at the same time, while this method is blocked, when I called the method, I passed a function. So this function has run. Now, what happens is that they pass you this thing called a device code. So once again, the code that's trying to get the access token is blocked. But they give you, here's a URL. And so my application kind of automatically brings this up. I'll put in the device code. I'll go ahead and choose next. And what happens, is that the user then has to log on through the browser. So it's a very secure logon. And after that, you're going to see that the application just continues. So once again, device code flow, is what Microsoft is going to recommend if you have, a need to authenticate, on a client side. Okay, let's look at one more. So the last one that we're going to look at is the app only. So when we have an app only, we don't use the public, we use the confidential client application builder. Now, I'm going to go back and I'm going to create a new application. So back here, this is going to be the app only demo. And with the app only demo, I'm going to choose web. So if you are doing an app only authentication, you basically have to use web because you have to have a secret because your application has to kind of pass the equivalent of a password to get an access token. Now, what's kind of interesting is you put web, but app-only token acquisition never requires a redirect URL, so we're going to leave that blank. So we'll go ahead and choose OK. And so now that we've done that, we have the application ID. So let me go back here, and if I go back into my app settings, I'm going to go ahead and swap out what the application ID is. Okay. And now the next thing we have to do is create a credential for the application. So the way we do that is we go down to where it says certificates and secrets. Now you can create a certificate or you can use an existing certificate, and that's going to be more secure, recommended for production, but we're going to use the easier path of just using a client secret. So if I say, give me a new secret, and I'll call this just secret 1, it creates a secret, and it basically allows you, okay, secret 1, it allows you to copy it right when you create it. So let's go ahead and copy that. Now let's bring it over here. So now the client ID is kind of the username. The client secret is the password that the application has. So now that we have that, let's go back to programs. Let's go ahead and kind of get rid of this one. Let's get rid of, and now we're going to add the app-only provider. Now, when you use an app-only token, you can't get the user information because there is no user. And so in our case right here, what we're going to do is basically we want to get the information about the org itself. Okay, now let's move back here. Since I'm getting a app-only token, one of the things that I can now do is when I ask for permissions, I can now ask for application permissions. So let's go ask for an application permission, and the one that we'll ask for is organization read write all. And maybe I want to do a whole bunch of work inside there. And note that once we have this permission inside, someone is going to have to grant that permission and it has to be a tenant administrator. You can create an application that has an interactive way to consent to admin, or in this case, I'm just going to go ahead and click grant. But now I've basically given this application, I've consented for it to use this application permission. Back here, let's go ahead and kind of take a look at the auth providers here. And so now we're going to say confidential client application, and there's the ID. Here is the secret, and then also note that you can't use a generic tenant like /common or /organizations. You have to, basically use the tenant-specific authority. And so if I take a look at that, what is the tenant-specific authority? It's going to have your tenant name or your tenant ID. Either you can have this tenant name or you can get the GUID for your tenant. Either one will work. Okay, so now that we've done that, we should now be able to run this application and basically acquire a app-only token. Let's go back here. Let's go ahead and remove. One more time, we'll go ahead and run this right here. And now what we see is that, let's go back here, and here is the call. There is the app-only token that has come back. Let's go ahead and send this to the text wizard. Once I've done that up here, I can kind of cut that out. And now let's use this trick one more time to kind of look at the auth-only token. So let's go back here, and I'll paste that in. And what we can see now is that when you have delegated permissions, they're under scopes. When you have application level permissions, they're under roles. So basically, this had the organization read write all inside of that app token, and that allowed it to make those calls in. Okay, so we're at the hour mark. I know it was going through a lot of stuff pretty quickly, but coming back to this particular outline that we have, for the exam, one of the things that let's come back here and open this up. And what are the skills? So understanding how to register applications. I don't think there's going to be anything on PowerShell, but as you do this in the real world, being able to have PowerShell scripts that automate this, is pretty important. Implementing authentication. So the one example I showed with the implicit, was basically doing a logon with MSAL.JS, configuring permissions. And what we can do with permissions is either you can configure them, in the application and then just ask for the default permissions, or as you acquire the access token, you can also pass the permission scopes. Okay. Also, we went through some of these other details, and definitely the information about authenticating with an app-only token. When they ask about creating a service to access the Microsoft Graph API, they want you to authenticate the user on the front end, but when your application calls in and actually works with the Graph API, that is when you will be using a app-only token. Okay, so I've got some other slides here I'll just kind of leave for your reference. Hopefully you found, this kind of information useful. Once again, let me call out if this type of training is of interest for you. I want to once again kind of point out our class, which is the Modern SharePoint and Microsoft Teams Development. We've recently added some pretty good, kind of doubled our coverage of Microsoft Teams. And if I kind of look at the, the Teams coverage, we have, the first lecture, which kind of covers building a Teams manifest, how do you use ngrok, how do you start adding tabs. And then we've just added a new lecture on dealing with messaging extensions like webhooks and creating custom bots with the new 4.6 bot framework. There's so much better integration, with the bot framework in Microsoft Teams. So other than that, I appreciate everyone who spent the time today to kind of look at the security model. I'd love to hear feedback, so either sending me something at ted.pattison@criticalpathtraining.com or info@criticalpathtraining.com. Love to hear from you about what you thought about this particular webinar and what topics you might like for webinars in the future.